I walked into what I thought was a casual family dinner and found my mother, three siblings, two cousins, and three lawyers seated around the dining table with thick legal documents spread across the mahogany surface. My mother's face was cold and determined as she looked directly at me and said, "We need you to sign these papers, transferring Grandpa Joe's estate." When I refused, the lead lawyer threatened legal action, and my brother stood up aggressively. I counted them calmly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're a lot of people. Funny thing is, I only brought one person too. 3 months ago, I never imagined I'd be sitting in this suffocating dining room, facing down my own family, like they were strangers plotting against me. Let me take you back to how this nightmare began, because understanding the path that led here makes everything that happened tonight make perfect sense. My grandfather Joe passed away unexpectedly on a Tuesday morning in September. He'd been working in his garden planting winter vegetables for the season ahead when his heart simply stopped. The man who built a construction empire worth $8 million died with dirt under his fingernails, exactly the way he would have wanted it. Joe Brennan was 78 years old and had spent every single day of his adult life working with his hands building something meaningful. I was the family disappointment, the grandson who chose to become a park ranger in Colorado, instead of pursuing what my mother called a respectable career. While my older brother Marcus struggled through law school and eventually opened a failing practice, and my sister Sarah earned her real estate license, only to watch her commissions disappear into mounting debt. I found peace in the mountains. My salary was modest, barely $32,000 a year, but I loved waking up to sunrise over the Rockies and spending my days protecting wilderness that would outlast all of us. The family gathering for Grandpa Joe's will reading took place in the sterile conference room of Henderson and Associates, the law firm that had handled his business affairs for decades. My mother sat rigidly in her black dress, flanked by Marcus in his cheap suit, and Sarah clutching a tissue box. My cousins Jake and Emma completed our small circle of expectation. Everyone assumed the inheritance would be divided equally, maybe with slightly larger portions going to Marcus and Sarah, since they had children and real responsibilities. When attorney David Henderson opened the manila envelope containing Grandpa Joe's final wishes, you could have heard a pin drop in that carpeted room. He cleared his throat and began reading in his practiced monotone. I, Joseph Michael Brennan, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my entire estate, including all properties, business assets, bank accounts, and personal possessions to my grandson, Robert James Brennan. The silence that followed felt like standing in the eye of a tornado. Then, my mother fainted, sliding from her leather chair onto the polished floor. Marcus jumped up so violently that his coffee cup shattered against the conference table, sending dark liquid across important-looking documents. Sarah's scream pierced the air like a wounded animal, and she began sobbing uncontrollably about how unfair life had become. "This can't be right," Marcus shouted, his face turning crimson. "There has to be a mistake. Rob doesn't know anything about business. He's a glorified park maintenance worker, living in some cabin in the middle of nowhere." Henderson calmly produced additional documentation, including medical certificates confirming Grandpa Joe's mental competency at the time of signing. My grandfather had anticipated exactly this reaction and taken every precaution to ensure his final wishes would be honored. He'd even included a sealed letter specifically for me, which Henderson handed over with professional detachment. As my family erupted into accusations and tears around me, I opened that letter with trembling fingers. Grandpa Joe's handwriting, still strong despite his age, filled 2 pages with words that would change everything I understood about the people I'd grown up loving. Robbie. It began using the nickname he'd called me since childhood. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and your family is probably acting exactly like I expected they would. Don't let their anger fool you into thinking you don't deserve what I'm leaving you. You're the only one who ever visited me, just to visit, not because you needed something. You're the only one who helped me in the garden without expecting payment. You're the only one who listened to my stories about building this business from nothing, really listened, instead of just waiting for your turn to ask for money." The letter continued with painful detail about conversations he'd overheard, phone calls he'd received, and visits from family members who only showed up when they needed financial assistance. Marcus had borrowed $47,000 over the past 3 years for his gambling debts. Sarah had taken $32,000 for her real estate ventures that consistently failed. Even my mother had been pressuring him to change his will to ensure fair distribution among all his grandchildren. "They're going to come after you," the letter warned. "They'll try everything from guilt to legal action to get what they think belongs to them. When they do, remember that I chose you, not because you're perfect, but because you're the only one who never asked me for anything. Stand strong when the wolves come circling, and trust that I had good reasons for every decision I made." That day in Henderson's office marked the beginning of 3 months of harassment that started subtle and gradually became more aggressive. My mother called twice daily, sometimes crying about family loyalty, other times coldly demanding I do the right thing and share the inheritance. Marcus threatened lawsuits he couldn't afford to file. Sarah sent me photos of her children with messages about their college funds and medical bills. I returned to my small cabin in the Rockies and tried to process everything that had happened. The inheritance sat untouched in Grandpa Joe's bank accounts, while I continued my work as a park ranger, living off my modest salary, exactly as I had before. Part of me hoped that giving my family time to grieve would help them understand and accept Grandpa Joe's decision. Another part of me suspected that hope was naive. Tonight's phone call from my mother had seemed different, warmer somehow. She claimed my cousin Emma was visiting from Portland and wanted to see everyone for a family reunion dinner. She emphasized how much she missed me and how important it was for the family to stay connected during this difficult time. Her voice carried none of the edge it had developed over the past 3 months. "Just come for dinner, sweetheart," she'd said, using the endearment she'd abandoned since the will reading. "Emma specifically asked about you, and it would mean the world to have all my children together again. We can put all this inheritance business behind us and focus on being a family." I should have recognized the manipulation, should have trusted the instincts that had kept me alive in the wilderness for years. But the lonely part of me, that still craved family connection, overruled my caution. I drove the 4 hours from my cabin to my childhood home, watching familiar landscapes blur past my truck windows, and hoping that maybe finally we could find our way back to being relatives who actually cared about each other. Walking up the front steps of the house where I'd grown up, I noticed my mother's flower beds looked neglected and brown. The porch light flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows across the welcome mat that had seen better days. Everything felt slightly off, like returning to a place that existed more clearly in memory than reality. But the revelation that awaited me inside that house exceeded even my darkest suspicions about my family's intentions. Grandpa Joe had been right about everything, and his letter had prepared me for exactly this moment, when the people who shared my blood would reveal who they really were, underneath all the holiday dinners and birthday cards. The lawyers sitting at my mother's dining table weren't there for a social visit, and this certainly wasn't any kind of family reunion dinner. The formal dining room had been transformed into something resembling a corporate boardroom, complete with legal documents spread across the table where we used to eat Thanksgiving dinner. James Patterson, the lead attorney, was a tall man in his 50s, with silver hair and expensive glasses that caught the overhead light as he gestured toward the papers. His 2 associates flanked him like bodyguards. Diana Walsh, a sharp-featured woman in a navy suit, who specialized in what she called inheritance irregularities, and Robert Hayes, a younger lawyer whose nervous energy suggested he was either new to this type of work or uncomfortable with it. Robert Patterson began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of intimidating people in courtrooms. "We've been conducting a thorough investigation into your grandfather's final months, and we've discovered some serious concerns about the validity of his will." He produced a manila folder thick with documentation and spread several papers across the polished wood surface. Medical records, witness statements, and what appeared to be legal affidavits covered the area where my mother's good china usually sat during family celebrations. The irony of using her best dinnerware as a backdrop for this legal ambush wasn't lost on me. These documents clearly indicate that Joseph Brennan was suffering from significant cognitive decline in his final year. Diana Walsh interjected, pointing to highlighted sections on various pages. We have statements from medical professionals, bank tellers, who noticed confusion during his transactions, and neighbors who observed erratic behavior. My mother leaned forward, her expression a carefully practiced combination of concern and righteousness. Sweetheart, we know this is difficult to accept, but Daddy wasn't himself toward the end. He was making strange decisions, forgetting conversations, even getting lost driving to places he'd been going for decades. The man who wrote that will wasn't the sharp businessman we all knew and loved. Marcus stood behind her chair, his presence clearly meant to intimidate. At 6 feet 2 inches and carrying extra weight from too many years of stress eating, my brother had always used his size to get his way during family disagreements. Tonight, his aggressive posture felt different, more calculated and desperate than the casual bullying of our childhood. The medical evidence is overwhelming. Patterson continued, sliding a thick report toward me. Your grandfather suffered a significant stroke 18 months before his death, which resulted in documented cognitive impairment. The neurologist's notes clearly indicate memory loss, confusion about financial matters, and vulnerability to manipulation. I picked up the medical report and scanned the first few pages, noting the official letterhead from Rocky Mountain Medical Center and what appeared to be genuine doctor signatures. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make these documents look authentic and convincing. The level of detail suggested months of preparation, rather than a hastily assembled fraud. Sarah, who had been quietly sobbing since I arrived, suddenly spoke up with trembling voice. Rob, you have to understand how desperate we all are right now. I'm facing foreclosure on my house next month. The bank has already sent the final notice, and my kids are going to lose the only home they've ever known. She pulled out her phone and showed me photos of her teenage daughter and young son, both smiling in what looked like recent school pictures. The emotional manipulation was obvious, but effective, designed to make me feel guilty for potentially destroying their futures by selfishly holding on to money I hadn't earned. And Marcus owes some very dangerous people a lot of money. My mother added, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if sharing a shameful family secret. People who don't accept excuses or payment plans. People who have made it very clear what happens to families who don't pay their debts. Jake, my cousin, who had remained silent until now, finally found his voice. I've been stealing from my employer to keep my family afloat, Rob. When they find out, I'm going to prison. My wife doesn't know yet, but I've taken over $100,000 from the retirement fund I manage. The audit is next month, and I'm completely screwed unless I can replace that money immediately. The confessions kept coming, each family member revealing increasingly desperate circumstances that painted their inheritance grab as a matter of survival rather than greed. My mother disclosed that she'd been secretly taking out second and third mortgages on the family home using Grandpa Joe's name and forged signatures to secure loans she couldn't possibly repay. The house where I'd grown up, the same house where we were sitting right now, was already scheduled for foreclosure proceedings. We're not trying to steal from you, she insisted, reaching across the table to touch my hand. We're trying to save our entire family from complete destruction. Daddy would have wanted his money to help all of us, not just one person who's going to waste it on some ridiculous wilderness preserve or whatever environmental nonsense you're planning. Patterson opened his briefcase and withdrew additional paperwork, this time focusing on what he called estate planning solutions. The documents would establish a family trust, controlled by my mother, with each family member receiving specific allocations based on their immediate needs and long-term financial goals. I would receive what he called a generous settlement of $200,000, enough to pay off my modest cabin and continue my park ranger career without financial stress. This approach protects everyone's interests. He explained, adjusting his expensive glasses and speaking in the patronizing tone lawyers used when explaining complex matters to people they considered intellectually inferior. You avoid the burden of managing millions of dollars you're not equipped to handle, while your family gets the help they desperately need to rebuild their lives. Diana Walsh produced a pen and positioned it near the signature lines, her movement casual but pointed. We've already prepared all the necessary documentation. Once you sign these transfer papers, we can begin the trust administration process immediately. Your family's financial emergencies will be resolved within days, rather than months. The pressure in the room was becoming suffocating, with 6 family members and 3 lawyers all staring at me expectantly. Outside, snow was beginning to fall more heavily, and I could see my truck in the driveway, looking increasingly like my only viable escape route. The familiar house where I'd spent my childhood suddenly felt like enemy territory. But I kept thinking about Grandpa Joe's letter and his specific warnings about exactly this scenario. The old man had predicted not just their greed, but the sophisticated legal approach they would use to steal what he'd left me. He'd known about their financial desperation, their willingness to forge documents, and their plans to manipulate me using guilt and family loyalty. Then, Patterson made the mistake that revealed the true scope of their criminal conspiracy. We've already been working with the bank to freeze certain estate accounts pending this legal resolution, he said casually, as if discussing routine paperwork rather than criminal fraud. The transition will be seamless once we have your cooperation. The room went silent, as everyone realized he'd just admitted to attempted theft on a massive scale. These weren't desperate family members asking for help. This was an organized criminal operation that had been planning to steal from Grandpa Joe for months, possibly years. They hadn't just prepared for tonight's meeting. They'd been actively working to steal the inheritance even before my grandfather died. The medical reports weren't just fabricated. Someone had bribed actual medical professionals to create false documentation about cognitive decline that never existed. They'd corrupted bank employees to attempt unauthorized access to estate accounts. This wasn't a family dispute about inheritance. It was a federal crime involving multiple conspirators and forged government documents. And I suddenly understood that Grandpa Joe's preparations had been far more extensive than I'd initially realized. Patterson's accidental admission about the bank accounts shifted the atmosphere in the room from uncomfortable pressure to barely contained panic. The lawyers exchanged glances that confirmed they'd revealed far more than intended, while my family members began to understand that their solution involved serious criminal activity rather than just family financial planning. Diana Walsh attempted to recover by explaining their actions as standard estate preservation procedures, but her nervous energy betrayed the fact that they'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. She produced additional documentation intended to legitimize their bank interventions, but the papers only proved how extensively they'd been planning this theft. Robert, you need to understand the gravity of your situation, Patterson said, his friendly lawyer demeanor evaporating into something much more threatening. We have compelling evidence that you manipulated a vulnerable elderly man during his final months. Isolation of elderly victims is a classic form of elder abuse, and the penalties for inheritance fraud can include both criminal prosecution and civil liability. He slid a thick legal brief across the table, its official appearance designed to intimidate rather than inform. The document detailed alleged instances where I supposedly influenced Grandpa Joe's decision-making, isolated him from family members, and coerced him into changing his will. Each accusation was supported by fabricated witness statements and falsified documentation that someone had spent considerable time and money creating. The district attorney's office takes elder abuse very seriously. Diana Walsh added her voice, carrying the kind of authority that suggested connections within the legal system. We've already had preliminary discussions about criminal charges, and the evidence against you is quite substantial. Inheritance fraud is a felony that carries mandatory minimum sentences, especially when the amounts involved exceed $1 million. Marcus stepped forward, positioning himself directly behind my chair in a way that felt threatening rather than protective. His physical presence was meant to reinforce the legal intimidation, making it clear that this wasn't just about paperwork and signatures. At 300 pounds of barely controlled anger, my brother represented the potential for physical consequences if I continued refusing their demands. "You don't understand what you're doing to all of us," he said, his voice tight with desperation and rage. "I owe $300,000 to people who break legs first and ask questions later. These aren't bank loans or credit card debts, Rob. These are the kind of people who collect debts from family members when the primary borrower disappears." He pulled out his phone and showed me photos of men in expensive suits standing outside Sarah's house and my mother's workplace. The images were clearly taken without their subject's knowledge. Surveillance photos meant to prove that dangerous people were already watching my family and waiting for payment that would never come without access to Grandpa Joe's money. Sarah's emotional breakdown became more intense as she realized the full scope of their legal strategy. "They're going to take my children away," she sobbed, clutching tissues and speaking between gasps for air. "When I lose the house and can't provide for them, social services will get involved. My babies will end up in foster care because their uncle was too selfish to help his own family." She showed me official-looking documents from the County Child Welfare Department notices about home inspections and financial stability requirements for maintaining custody of minor children. Whether real or fabricated, the papers suggested that her children's futures depended entirely on resolving her financial crisis immediately. Jake's confession became more detailed and desperate as he described the specific timeline of his embezzlement discovery. "The retirement fund audit is scheduled for December 15th. He said, checking his watch, as if counting down to his inevitable arrest. "When they find the missing money, they'll call the police immediately. My wife is pregnant with our third child, and she'll be giving birth while I'm sitting in county jail, waiting for my federal sentencing hearing." My mother stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the falling snow with her back turned to the table. When she spoke, her voice carried a mixture of resignation and manipulation that I'd heard throughout my childhood whenever she wanted something important. "Your grandfather built that business to take care of his family," she said without turning around. "Every dollar he earned was meant to ensure that his children and grandchildren would have better lives than he did. You're destroying everything he worked for by hoarding money you'll never be able to properly manage." She turned back toward the table, her eyes red with tears that might have been genuine or carefully calculated for maximum emotional impact. "I carried him for 9 months, raised him when his father abandoned us, and spent 40 years taking care of him when he got sick. That money represents my entire life sacrifice, and you're throwing it away because you're too proud to admit you don't belong in the business world." Patterson opened a new folder and produced what appeared to be a court order signed by a local judge. The official documentation looked authentic, complete with raised seals and judicial signatures that would be difficult to forge convincingly. The order authorized emergency psychological evaluation for individuals suspected of mental instability affecting their decision-making capacity. "We've obtained preliminary approval for emergency intervention." He explained, his tone suggesting this was routine legal procedure rather than kidnapping. When individuals inherit large sums unexpectedly, especially those without business experience or financial sophistication, the courts sometimes require professional evaluation to ensure they're capable of managing such responsibilities. Diana Walsh's briefcase contained additional papers that detailed the evaluation process, including residential treatment facilities where I would be held during the assessment period. The duration could range from several weeks to several months, depending on the complexity of my case and the professional recommendations of their psychiatric experts. "The evaluation team is already standing by." Patterson continued, checking his expensive watch, as if coordinating with people outside the house. "Dr. Elizabeth Morgan specializes in inheritance-related psychological assessments, and she's prepared to begin your evaluation immediately." The process is completely voluntary, of course, but refusing to cooperate would raise additional questions about your mental state and judgment. Marcus moved closer to the dining room exit, while Jake positioned himself near the front door. Their movement seemed casual, but coordinated, suggesting they'd planned for the possibility that I might try to leave before signing the documents. The house where I'd grown up was becoming a prison with my own family serving as guards. Robert Hayes, the youngest lawyer who had remained mostly silent throughout the evening, finally spoke up with obvious discomfort. Perhaps we should allow Robert some time to consider his options privately. These are significant decisions that shouldn't be rushed, and family matters often benefit from careful reflection. His suggestion was immediately overruled by Patterson, who clearly controlled the legal strategy and had no intention of allowing me time to escape or seek outside counsel. The window for voluntary cooperation was closing rapidly, and they were prepared to use whatever methods necessary to secure my signature on their fraudulent documents. Through the dining room window, I could see headlights approaching the house, slowly through the falling snow. Multiple vehicles were arriving simultaneously, their timing too coordinated to be coincidental visitors. The psychiatric evaluation team wasn't just standing by. They were already here and preparing to take me into custody regardless of my consent. But as I watched those headlights getting closer, I felt completely calm. Grandpa Joe's letter had prepared me for exactly this scenario, warning me that they would eventually resort to threats, intimidation, and even false imprisonment to steal his money. More importantly, he'd given me specific instructions about what to do when they finally revealed the full scope of their criminal conspiracy. The psychiatric team entered through the front door, without knocking their professional appearance and medical equipment designed to legitimize what was essentially kidnapping. Dr. Morgan introduced herself with cold efficiency, explaining that she'd been briefed on my case and was prepared to begin the evaluation process immediately for my own safety and the protection of my family. That's when I realized the one person Grandpa Joe had told me to bring wasn't someone I'd invited to tonight's meeting. It was someone who had been watching and waiting for exactly this moment, someone with the authority and evidence necessary to stop this criminal conspiracy before it destroyed what remained of my family. And she was already here. As Dr. Morgan and her two assistants entered the dining room carrying psychiatric evaluation equipment and what appeared to be medication designed to sedate uncooperative patients, I remained seated at the table with a calmness that seemed to unnerve everyone present. Instead of panicking or attempting to flee, I slowly pulled out my phone and opened an application I'd been using all evening without anyone noticing. December 27th, 9:43 p.m. I said clearly, speaking directly into my phone's microphone. I'm at 417 Maple Street in Millfield, Colorado, in my mother's dining room. Present are my mother, Linda Brennan, my brother, Marcus Brennan, my sister, Sarah Brennan, my cousins, Jake and Emma Brennan, attorneys James Patterson, Diana Walsh, and Robert Hayes, and Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, with two unidentified medical assistants. The room went completely silent as everyone realized I'd been recording our entire conversation from the moment I'd arrived. Every confession, every threat, every admission of criminal activity had been captured on digital audio that could be used as evidence in criminal proceedings. I am clearly stating for the record that I have not consented to any psychiatric evaluation, that I am being held against my will, and that the legal documents presented tonight contain fraudulent information designed to steal my grandfather's inheritance through criminal conspiracy. I continued, my voice steady and clear. My mother's face went white as she understood the implications of being recorded while discussing forged medical documents and bribed court officials. Marcus stepped back from his intimidating position, suddenly aware that his threats had been preserved as evidence of criminal coercion. Let me tell you what my grandfather Joe Brennan really did during his final months, I said, standing up from the table and facing the group that had been trying to manipulate and threaten me all evening. The man you claimed was suffering from cognitive decline actually spent that time investigating his own family and building a criminal case against every single person in this room. I explained how Grandpa Joe had become suspicious when family members who rarely visited suddenly started showing up regularly, always with financial problems and requests for loans. The pattern was too obvious to ignore his children, and grandchildren only contacted him when they needed money, and their desperation was escalating beyond normal financial stress. He hired Detective Riley Thompson, a retired FBI agent who specializes in white-collar crime investigations. I continued watching their faces as they realized how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered. Detective Thompson spent 6 months documenting Marcus's gambling debts, Sarah's embezzlement from her real estate clients, Jake's theft from his employer's retirement fund, and my mother's forged signatures on loan applications. The private investigation had uncovered far more than simple financial desperation. Thompson had discovered that Patterson's law firm was part of a sophisticated inheritance fraud ring that targeted wealthy elderly individuals across multiple states. They had a network of corrupt medical professionals, bribed court officials, and falsified psychiatric evaluations that allowed them to steal millions of dollars from families who trusted them. Thompson traced Patterson's operation back 5 years and found 47 families who lost their inheritances to the same fraudulent scheme you tried to run tonight. I explained pulling out copies of the investigative report that detailed the criminal enterprise in devastating detail. The total theft exceeds $30 million, making this a federal racketeering case with mandatory minimum sentences for everyone involved. Detective Thompson had also discovered that my family's financial problems weren't the result of bad luck or poor decisions. Marcus had been recruited by Patterson's organization as an inside source for identifying potential inheritance fraud targets. His gambling debts were real, but they were also being used to pressure him into betraying his own family for the promise of a percentage of whatever they could steal. Sarah's real estate problems weren't coincidental either. She'd been systematically stealing down payments from homebuyers and using the money to fund her lifestyle, while building up enough debt to make her desperate for any solution. Her criminal activity made her vulnerable to recruitment by the fraud ring, which promised to resolve her legal problems in exchange for her cooperation in targeting Grandpa Joe. Jake's embezzlement wasn't desperation. I continued watching my cousin's face as he realized how thoroughly his criminal activity had been documented. He was recruited specifically because his position gave him access to retirement funds that could be temporarily borrowed to finance the fraud operation. His employer doesn't know about the missing money because Thompson convinced them to delay their audit until federal authorities could build a complete criminal case. Even my mother's role was more complex than simple family manipulation. She'd been forging Grandpa Joe's signature on financial documents for over 2 years, gradually transferring small amounts of money to accounts controlled by Patterson's organization. Her mounting debt wasn't the cause of her criminal activity. It was the result of her participation in a systematic theft operation that had been targeting her own father. The medical reports you showed me tonight are forgeries, but you already know that, I said, addressing Patterson directly. Dr. Morgan isn't a legitimate psychiatrist. She's an actress hired by your organization to play the role of a medical professional. Her evaluation equipment is props, and her medication is designed to incapacitate victims until you can complete the document fraud. Patterson's face had gone completely pale as he realized that his entire operation had been under federal surveillance for months. Every phone call, every forged document, every bribed official had been monitored and recorded by law enforcement agencies, building the largest inheritance fraud case in Colorado state history. Detective Thompson's investigation had also revealed the most shocking truth of all: Grandpa Joe wasn't actually dead. My grandfather discovered that your organization was planning to murder him when legal theft became too difficult. I explained, watching the room erupt into chaos, as family members realized they'd been mourning someone who was very much alive. The funeral you attended was staged by federal authorities to protect him, while they gathered evidence against everyone involved in the murder conspiracy. The hospital visits, the medical emergency, the death certificate, Even the burial ceremony had all been elaborate theater designed to keep Grandpa Joe safe, while law enforcement built their case. He'd been living in federal protective custody for 3 months, helping investigators understand exactly how the inheritance fraud ring operated and which family members were willing participants versus unwilling victims. Agent Lisa Chen of the FBI has been monitoring tonight's meeting from outside. I concluded, pointing toward the window, where additional headlights were now visible through the falling snow. Every word spoken in this room has been recorded as evidence for multiple federal criminal cases. The psychiatric team you brought isn't here to evaluate me. They're here to arrest you. The front door opened, and Agent Chen entered with a federal warrant and backup officers ready to take multiple suspects into custody. The inheritance fraud investigation was finally complete, and the evidence gathered tonight would ensure that everyone involved in the conspiracy faced appropriate federal charges. But the most important revelation was still coming. Agent Lisa Chen entered my mother's dining room with the quiet authority of someone who had been building this case for over 2 years. She was a petite woman in her late 30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and she carried herself with the confidence of an FBI agent who specialized in dismantling organized financial crime operations. Behind her, 6 federal agents in tactical gear secured the perimeter and began documenting everything in the room as evidence. "Good evening, everyone," Agent Chen said, producing her badge and federal warrant while surveying the panicked faces around the dining table. "I'm Special Agent Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We've been investigating Patterson, Walsh & Associates for inheritance fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit murder. Everyone present tonight is being detained pending formal charges." She began reading Miranda rights, while her team photographed the forged documents spread across the table. Each piece of fabricated evidence would be cataloged and used to build federal cases against the lawyers, medical professionals, and family members who had participated in what she described as the largest inheritance fraud operation ever uncovered in the western United States. "Mr. Patterson, your law firm has been under federal surveillance for 26 months. Agent Chen explained, as agents placed handcuffs on the lead attorney and began searching his briefcase. "We have recordings of you discussing murder for hire, bribing medical professionals to falsify documents, and conspiracy to commit fraud across state lines. The RICO charges alone carry a mandatory minimum of 20 years in federal prison." Patterson attempted to claim attorney-client privilege, but Agent Chen calmly explained that the privilege didn't extend to criminal conspiracy or planning violent felonies. His law firm's client files were already being seized by federal authorities, and the evidence would be used to identify additional victims and prosecute everyone involved in the criminal enterprise. Diana Walsh made a desperate attempt to destroy her briefcase full of forged documents, but federal agents stopped her before she could eliminate evidence that would be crucial for prosecuting dozens of other cases. Her expertise in inheritance irregularities actually involved creating falsified medical records, bribing court officials, and training other lawyers to replicate the fraud operation in different states. "Ms. Walsh, you're facing federal charges for racketeering, conspiracy fraud, and accessory to murder." Agent Chen continued supervising as agents secured the evidence that would ensure decades of federal prison time. "Your cooperation in identifying other victims and explaining the operational structure of this criminal enterprise will be considered during sentencing, but the evidence against you is overwhelming, regardless of whether you choose to cooperate." Robert Hayes, the youngest attorney, immediately began confessing everything he knew about the operation. His nervous energy throughout the evening had been justified. He'd been recruited recently and was horrified to discover that the law firm he joined was actually a criminal organization that murdered clients for their money. "I only participated in 3 cases," he said, speaking rapidly as agents read him his rights. "I didn't know about the murders until last month, and I've been trying to figure out how to report it to authorities without getting killed myself. I have copies of documents and recordings of conversations that prove how the operation works." Agent Chen's investigation had uncovered 47 successful inheritance fraud cases, totaling $31 million in stolen money. But the most shocking discovery was the pattern of suspicious deaths among elderly victims who had initially resisted signing their estates over to the criminal organization. 12 victims had died in apparent accidents or natural causes that occurred immediately after they'd threatened to contact law enforcement. Your Uncle Tommy Brennan was one of our first identified victims, Agent Chen told me, while agents began arresting my family members one by one. His car accident 5 years ago wasn't an accident. He'd discovered that his wife was working with Patterson's organization to steal his construction business, and he was planning to contact the FBI when they arranged his murder. The revelation that Uncle Tommy had been murdered by the same organization, now targeting our family, added another dimension to the criminal conspiracy. Patterson's group had been operating in our area for at least 5 years, systematically targeting successful business owners and murdering anyone who threatened to expose their operation. Mr. Marcus Brennan, you're under arrest for conspiracy fraud and accessory to murder, Agent Chen announced as agents placed my brother in handcuffs. Your gambling debts were artificially created by the criminal organization to pressure you into cooperation. The people you owe money to work for Patterson's group, and your debts would have been forgiven in exchange for helping them steal your grandfather's estate. Marcus's role had been to provide inside information about Grandpa Joe's finances, health conditions, and family relationships that would be useful for planning the fraud operation. His desperate financial situation wasn't the cause of his cooperation. It was a tool used to manipulate him into betraying his own family. Sarah's arrest revealed that her real estate fraud had been even more extensive than anyone realized. She'd been stealing down payments from homebuyers for 3 years, using the money to fund Patterson's operation in exchange for promises that she'd receive a percentage of whatever they could steal from elderly victims. Sarah Brennan, you're facing federal charges for wire fraud, money laundering conspiracy, and accessory to murder, Agent Chen explained, as my sister was led away in handcuffs. Your children will be placed in protective custody with their father until the criminal proceedings are resolved. Child welfare services will determine appropriate long-term placement based on the outcome of your federal trial. Jake's embezzlement charges were complicated by his role as a recruitment tool for the criminal organization. His position managing retirement funds had given him access to money that could be temporarily borrowed to finance fraud operations against elderly victims. His participation wasn't just theft, it was organized crime that had funded multiple murders. My mother's arrest was perhaps the most painful to watch, even though her criminal activity had been the most extensive and long-term. She'd been forging Grandpa Joe's signature and stealing money from his accounts for over 3 years, gradually building up the financial records that would support their eventual claim that he was mentally incompetent. Linda Brennan, you're under arrest for elder abuse fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and racketeering, Agent Chen announced, as agents searched my mother's purse and found additional forged documents. You were recruited by Patterson's organization, specifically because your access to your father gave you opportunities to create the evidence they needed to steal his estate. The most shocking revelation came when Agent Chen explained that tonight's meeting had been designed to end with my murder, not just the theft of Grandpa Joe's inheritance. The psychiatric evaluation was a cover story for administering drugs that would kill me while making my death appear to be suicide driven by guilt over manipulating an elderly relative. Dr. Morgan isn't a doctor, Agent Chen explained as agents arrested the woman who had been prepared to murder me with fake medication. She's a nurse recruited by the criminal organization to kill victims who refuse to cooperate with the fraud operation. The equipment she brought contains lethal drugs designed to simulate heart failure. Your death would have been ruled suicide, and your family would have inherited the estate they've been trying to steal. The federal investigation had been so successful because Detective Thompson's work had provided early warning that allowed agents to monitor the entire conspiracy as it developed. Every phone call, every forged document, every criminal conversation had been recorded as evidence that would ensure everyone involved received appropriate federal sentences. But the most important revelation was still coming, and it would change everything I thought I understood about the past 3 months. As federal agents continued processing arrests and securing evidence, Agent Chen gestured for me to step into the kitchen, where we could speak privately, while my family was being read their rights and prepared for transport to federal detention facilities. The house where I'd grown up was now an active crime scene, with photographers documenting everything and agents cataloging evidence that would be used in multiple federal trials. "Rob, there's something else you need to know about your grandfather," Agent Chen said, closing the kitchen door to give us privacy, while the chaos continued in the dining room. "Joseph Brennan isn't dead. He's alive and healthy in federal protective custody, and he's been working with our investigation team for the past 3 months." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, even though part of me had begun to suspect something wasn't right about Grandpa Joe's death and funeral. The closed casket ceremony, the rushed burial, the way Detective Thompson had seemed to know exactly what evidence to look for. All of it made sense now that I understood the truth. We discovered the murder plot against your grandfather 6 weeks before his scheduled death. Agent Chen explained, showing me photographs from the federal safe house where Grandpa Joe had been living since his supposed funeral. Detective Thompson's investigation uncovered phone conversations where your family members discussed hiring professional killers to stage an accident that would look natural. The plan had been sophisticated and would probably have succeeded if Thompson hadn't been monitoring their communications as part of his broader investigation into Patterson's criminal organization. Marcus had been instructed to arrange for loan shark associates to kill Grandpa Joe in a way that wouldn't raise suspicions, while my mother would provide access to his house and daily schedule. Your grandfather volunteered to fake his death so we could gather evidence against everyone involved. Agent Chen continued pulling out her phone to show me recent photos of Grandpa Joe working in a garden at his federal protection facility. He wanted to make sure we caught everyone, including the family members who were willing to murder him for money. In the dining room, I could hear Marcus shouting about being framed while agents loaded him into a transport vehicle. His protests about innocence were particularly disturbing, given that Agent Chen was simultaneously showing me recorded phone conversations where he discussed specific methods for killing Grandpa Joe without detection. Sarah's emotional breakdown had escalated into complete hysteria as she realized her children would be placed in protective custody and she would likely spend the next 20 years in federal prison. Her cries about unfairness and family loyalty rang hollow against the documented evidence of her 3-year participation in systematically stealing from elderly victims. The inheritance fraud operation has been stealing money from families across 12 states, Agent Chen explained, as we watched agents carry boxes of evidence from the dining room to their vehicles. Your grandfather's case became our key to understanding how the entire organization worked, because his family was so willing to cooperate with obviously criminal activities. Jake's confession had provided crucial details about how the criminal organization recruited participants and maintained control over them through manufactured debt and blackmail. His embezzlement wasn't discovered by his employer because federal authorities had convinced the company to delay their audit until the larger investigation could be completed. My mother's arrest had been particularly devastating because her criminal activity extended far beyond just forging Grandpa Joe's signature. She'd been actively recruiting other families for Patterson's organization, identifying elderly relatives of her friends and neighbors who might be vulnerable to inheritance fraud schemes. Linda Brennan helped target 17 other families for inheritance fraud. Agent Chen said, showing me a chart that detailed the scope of my mother's criminal activity. Her role wasn't just stealing from her own father. She was a recruiter and facilitator for the broader criminal enterprise. Some of those families lost everything, and 3 elderly victims died under suspicious circumstances. The legal consequences for each family member were staggering and reflected the serious nature of federal organized crime charges. Patterson faced a minimum of 35 years for racketeering conspiracy to commit murder and fraud across state lines. His leadership role in the criminal organization made him eligible for life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Diana Walsh's specialized expertise in creating fraudulent medical documents had made her invaluable to the operation, but also ensured that her criminal liability was extensive. Federal prosecutors were seeking 25 years for racketeering conspiracy and accessory to murder, with additional state charges pending in every state where she'd participated in inheritance fraud. Marcus would face federal charges carrying 22 years minimum sentence, but his cooperation in the planned murder of Grandpa Joe meant he could potentially be charged with conspiracy to commit murder, which carried life imprisonment. His gambling debts, which had seemed like personal problems, were actually evidence of his recruitment and control by the criminal organization. Sarah's charges included 15 years for fraud and conspiracy, plus additional state charges for her real estate theft that could add another decade to her sentence. More importantly, she would lose custody of her children permanently, as federal authorities had documented her willingness to participate in murder conspiracies that made her unfit for parenting. Jake faced 12 years for embezzlement and conspiracy charges, but his cooperation with investigators might reduce his sentence slightly. His wife would file for divorce once she learned about his criminal activity, and their unborn child would grow up knowing that their father chose to participate in organized crime rather than seek legitimate help for his financial problems. My mother's charges were the most extensive because of her long-term participation and recruitment activities. Federal prosecutors were seeking 25 years for elder abuse, racketeering conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud, with little possibility of reduced sentencing given the scope of her criminal activity. The broader investigation has identified 134 victims of Patterson's organization across 12 states. Agent Chen explained, as the last of the evidence boxes were loaded into federal transport vehicles. Your family's willingness to cooperate with obviously criminal activities helped us understand how the organization recruited and controlled participants. But beyond the legal consequences, the community impact would be devastating and long-lasting. The scandal would destroy what remained of the family's reputation in Millfield, a small town where everyone knew everyone, and criminal activity on this scale was unprecedented in local memory. Your grandfather wants to see you, Agent Chen said, handing me a secure phone that would connect me directly to his federal protection facility. He's been worried about you throughout this investigation, and he wants to explain why he had to fake his death to protect both of you. As I took the phone and prepared to speak with the grandfather, I'd been mourning for 3 months. I realized that the hardest part of this entire experience wasn't watching my family get arrested for their crimes. The hardest part was understanding that the people who raised me, who I'd loved and trusted despite their flaws, had been willing to murder the man who'd given them everything just to steal money they hadn't earned. But there was still one more shock waiting, one final revelation that would explain why tonight's events had been even more dangerous than I'd realized. 6 months after that devastating December night, I found myself sitting on the front porch of a log cabin in western Montana, watching the sunrise paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and pink that no photograph could capture. The view stretched for miles across wilderness that would remain protected long after all of us were gone, a perspective that had helped me process everything that had happened to my family and find peace with decisions I never thought I'd have to make. Grandpa Joe sat beside me in his favorite rocking chair, looking healthier and more content than I'd seen him in years. The federal protection program had given him access to excellent medical care, regular exercise, and the kind of stress-free environment that had allowed his natural vitality to return. At 79 years old, he was building furniture in his workshop, mentoring young men from the local community, and living each day with the satisfaction of someone who had stood up to corruption and won. "You did good, Robbie," he said, using the childhood nickname that always made me feel like I was 10 years old again. "I know it wasn't easy watching your own family get arrested, but they made their choices long before that night. You just refused to let them destroy everyone else along the way." The federal trials had concluded 3 weeks ago, with convictions and sentences that reflected the serious nature of organized crime charges. James Patterson received 37 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. His leadership role in the inheritance fraud ring, making him eligible for the maximum penalties under racketeering statutes. Diana Walsh got 28 years, while Robert Hayes received 8 years and 3 years probation in exchange for his cooperation in identifying additional victims and criminal participants. Marcus was sentenced to 25 years for conspiracy fraud and attempted murder, his willingness to arrange Grandpa Joe's killing, eliminating any possibility of reduced sentencing. Sarah received 18 years for fraud and conspiracy, with permanent loss of custody rights that meant her children would grow up in foster care, rather than with a mother who'd chosen money over family loyalty. Jake's cooperation with federal investigators earned him a reduced sentence of 10 years, but his wife had divorced him and moved across the country with their children to escape the scandal. His unborn child would never know their father outside the context of his criminal convictions and imprisonment. My mother's 22-year sentence reflected not just her individual crimes, but her role in recruiting other families for Patterson's operation. Her participation in targeting elderly victims for theft and murder had made her one of the most culpable participants in the conspiracy, and federal prosecutors had shown no mercy during sentencing. The hardest part for me wasn't the danger, Grandpa Joe said, pouring coffee from a thermos and watching steam rise in the cool mountain air. The hardest part was learning that my own daughter was willing to kill me for money she wouldn't have known how to manage anyway. But you can't save people from themselves, Robbie. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let them face the consequences of their choices. The broader federal investigation had dismantled inheritance fraud operations in 14 states, recovering over $42 million in stolen assets and providing restitution to families who had lost everything to the criminal conspiracy. Patterson's organization had been operating for 7 years, systematically targeting elderly business owners and murdering anyone who threatened to expose their crimes. I'd used a substantial portion of Grandpa Joe's inheritance to establish the Brennan Foundation for Wilderness Youth Development, a program that combined wilderness therapy with practical life skills, training for young people who had experienced family trauma or criminal justice involvement. The program operated from a ranch in Colorado, giving at-risk teenagers the chance to develop confidence and purpose through outdoor challenges and vocational training. "You're doing exactly what I hoped you'd do with that money," Grandpa Joe said, nodding toward the folder of program reports I'd brought to share with him. "Building something that helps people, instead of just accumulating wealth for its own sake. That's the difference between you and the rest of the family. You understand that money is a tool, not a goal." The Wilderness Program had already graduated its first class of participants, young men and women who had transformed their lives through intensive outdoor experiences and practical education in construction land management and environmental conservation. Several graduates had gone on to careers with the National Park Service, or started their own businesses using skills they'd learned through the program. Detective Riley Thompson had joined the foundation as our security consultant, using his law enforcement background to help participants who had been involved with the criminal justice system. His daughter Emma, a licensed social worker, had become our program director and brought expertise in trauma recovery and family systems therapy. "I've been thinking about something," Grandpa Joe said, watching a pair of eagles soar above the valley below us. "All those years I spent building that construction business, I thought the important thing was leaving you kids financial security. But the real inheritance wasn't the money. It was the lesson about standing up for what's right, even when people you love are choosing wrong." Emma Thompson had also become an important part of my personal life. Our shared commitment to helping young people overcome family trauma, creating a bond that had gradually developed into something deeper. Her understanding of the psychological impact of family betrayal had helped me process the guilt and grief that came with watching my own relatives choose crime over integrity. We planned to marry in the spring with a simple ceremony in the mountains, overlooking the ranch where we both worked. Grandpa Joe would walk Emma down the aisle, having become the father figure she'd needed since her own dad's retirement from law enforcement. Our life together would be built around shared values of service, environmental conservation, and helping young people find their way through difficult circumstances. The saddest part. I reflected watching the sun climb higher above the mountain ridges, is that they already had everything they needed. We weren't a wealthy family, but we had enough. They destroyed their lives trying to steal money that wouldn't have made them happy anyway. The community response in Millfield had been a mixture of shock, disappointment, and ultimately relief that the criminal conspiracy had been exposed before more families could be victimized. Local banks had implemented stronger protections for elderly customers, and the county had established better oversight for legal services that targeted vulnerable populations. Sarah's children were thriving in foster care with a family that provided stability and genuine affection rather than the chaos and manipulation they'd experienced with their mother. The younger boy had no memory of the criminal activities, while his teenage sister was receiving counseling that helped her understand that her mother's choices weren't her responsibility or her fault. I learned something important about forgiveness. I said accepting a refill of coffee and watching steam disappear into the clear mountain air. Forgiving someone doesn't mean you have to trust them again or let them back into your life. It means you stop letting their choices poison your own future. The Wilderness program had taught me that healing from family trauma required both distance and time, but also active engagement in meaningful work that helped other people overcome similar challenges. Several of our program participants had experienced family abandonment or betrayal, and their recovery process had helped me understand my own healing journey. Your parents and siblings made their choices long before that December night. Grandpa Joe observed his voice, carrying the wisdom of someone who had spent months thinking about family loyalty and the difference between love and enabling destructive behavior. You didn't put them in prison. You just refused to let them take you down with them. The foundation had also established scholarships for young people whose families had been victimized by inheritance fraud, recognizing that children often suffered the greatest consequences when parents chose criminal activity over legitimate work. These scholarships provided college funding and vocational training that helped break the cycle of financial desperation that made families vulnerable to criminal recruitment. As I sat on that porch with the grandfather, I'd thought I'd lost watching morning light transform the landscape into something that belonged on a postcard. I understood that the most valuable inheritance he'd given me wasn't the money in his bank accounts. It was the example of someone who chose to do what was right, even when it was difficult, dangerous, and personally costly. The real lesson. I said, thinking about the young people who would arrive at our ranch next week for a new session of wilderness therapy, is that integrity isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing to do the right thing when people you care about are trying to convince you to do wrong. Grandpa Joe nodded, rocking slowly in his chair and watching the eagles that had become regular visitors to our morning coffee sessions. That's why I knew you were the right person to handle that inheritance, Robbie. Not because you were smarter or better than the rest of the family, but because you were the only one who never asked me for anything. That told me everything I needed to know about your character. The foundation would continue growing, eventually expanding to serve young people across the western United States who needed second chances and the kind of practical life skills that came from working with their hands in challenging outdoor environments. Our success would be measured not in money accumulated, but in lives transformed and communities strengthened. As we prepared to head inside for breakfast and another day of meaningful work, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that December evening when I'd walked into what I thought was a family dinner. The people who shared my blood had chosen to become strangers through their criminal activities. But I'd found a new family built around shared values rather than shared genetics. One more thing, Grandpa Joe said, standing up from his rocking chair, with the energy of someone who had discovered that survival was sweeter when you'd earned it through courage rather than compromise. Don't ever feel guilty about the choices you made that night. Sometimes, protecting yourself is the same thing as protecting everyone else. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable people who are determined to destroy themselves. Those words would stay with me as Emma and I continued building our life together in the mountains, helping young people discover that their family circumstances didn't have to determine their futures, and that sometimes the greatest inheritance anyone can receive is the example of someone who chose to do right when doing wrong would have been easier. Now, I want to ask you something that connects to all of our lives. Have you ever faced a situation where doing the right thing meant standing up to people you loved, even when it was painful and lonely? Family loyalty is important, but where do you draw the line when that loyalty enables harmful or destructive behavior? Share your thoughts in the comments below about how you've navigated the difficult balance between supporting family members and protecting yourself from their poor choices. Your experiences might help someone else who's facing similar challenges. If this story resonated with you, and you believe others might benefit from hearing about the importance of integrity over family pressure, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about people who chose courage over compromise. And please share this story with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone in facing difficult family situations. Thank you for listening to this journey of betrayal, courage, and ultimately hope. Remember that your character isn't determined by the family you were born into, but by the choices you make when those relationships are tested. Sometimes, standing alone is the price of standing up, but it's a price worth paying to protect your integrity and the people who depend on you to do what's right. Until next time, choose courage over comfort, and remember that the most important inheritance you can leave or receive isn't money. It's the example of someone who refused to compromise their values when it mattered most.